For 1,000 years, there was a wall that nobody could get through. It stood across the neck of a peninsula in what is now Istanbul, and it had turned back everyone who ever tried it. Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Persians. 3 lines deep, with a moat in front and towers along its length, it had held since the 5th century. Empires had broken themselves against it. It was not merely a fortification. It was the reason the Eastern Roman Empire still existed 1,000 years after the Western one had died. In the spring of 1453, a 21-year-old Ottoman sultan arrived outside it with something new. It was a cannon, and it was the largest anyone had ever built. Over 8 meters long, cast in bronze by a Hungarian engineer who had offered his services to the Byzantines first and been turned down because they could not pay him. It took 60 oxen to drag it into position. It could fire a stone ball weighing half a ton. It could be loaded and fired perhaps 7 times a day, and after each shot, the barrel had to be cooled with oil. It did not need to be quick. It only needed to keep hitting the same place. On the 29th of May, after 53 days, the Ottomans came through the broken wall and the Roman Empire ended. The thing that broke it was not the bronze. It was a gray powder in the bridge, made of 3 cheap ingredients, invented 600 years earlier by men who were not looking for a weapon at all. They were looking for a way to live forever. Gunpowder is 3 things ground together, and the whole of its history is in the proportions. Charcoal, which burns. Sulphur, which burns easily and at a low temperature, so it catches first and spreads the flame. And saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which is the trick, the part that makes the other 2 into a weapon. Because ordinary fire needs air. Take the oxygen away and it dies. That is what a lid on a pan does. Saltpeter carries its own oxygen, locked in its molecules, and when it gets hot, it lets that oxygen go. Which means gunpowder does not need the air around it. It carries its atmosphere with it. It will burn, sealed inside a bronze tube or underwater, or packed into a hole in a rock, and it will burn extremely fast, turning from solid to gas in an instant, expanding several thousand times over. That expansion is the entire point. Everything that follows, every gun, every mine, every quarry, every firework, is that one fact being applied. And here is the strange part. For most of human history, the way you moved something heavy was muscle, your own, an animal's, or a slave's. Gunpowder was the first time our species could reach into a substance and take out a burst of force far larger than any body could produce. We had found a way to store violence in a barrel and carry it around. It was discovered by people trying to do the opposite. In China, from about the 2nd century, alchemists worked on a serious and respectable problem: how to make a human being live forever. They tested minerals, metals, plant extracts. They fed emperors mercury and lead and cinnabar, and several emperors died of it. And the work continued anyway. Saltpeter was one of their materials. It occurred naturally as a white crust on the walls of caves and stables, and they knew it did strange things to fire. By the 9th century, a Taoist text records the result of mixing it with sulphur and charcoal, and the entry is not a recipe. It is a warning. It notes that some who did this had their hands and faces burned off and their houses burned down, and it advises against it. That is the first written description of gunpowder in human history, a health and safety notice. They called it huo yao, fire drug. The word for medicine stayed attached to it for centuries. long after anyone was pretending it was medicine. Men looking for eternal life had found the most efficient way yet devised to end it. The Chinese did not sit on it. Within a couple of centuries, the fire drug was a whole weapons program. First came fire arrows, a paper tube of powder strapped to a shaft, which was really an incendiary. Then something far stranger, the fire lance, a bamboo tube tied to a spear, which threw a jet of flame and scrap metal for a few seconds. It was a flamethrower, and it is the ancestor of every gun that has ever been made. Then somebody noticed that if you made the tube out of metal instead of bamboo and packed it tighter, the scraps came out faster. By the 12th century, there are bombs with cast iron casings designed to fragment the world's first shrapnel. By the 13th, there are hand cannon, short metal tubes on poles, awkward, inaccurate, and completely new. There are rockets. There are mines. Chinese military manuals of the period read disconcertingly like a modern armory, and they were used in the wars between the Song and the Jin, and later the Mongols. Cities were attacked with explosives and defended with them. For roughly 300 years, one civilization had this and nobody else did. That was never going to last. What moved it was the largest land empire in history. The Mongols fought the Chinese, absorbed their engineers, and then carried the technology across Eurasia in the saddlebags of the most mobile army in the world. They used gunpowder weapons in Persia, in Russia, in Hungary. Every place they attacked got a demonstration. By the middle of the 13th century, the recipe is written down in the Islamic world in Arabic with the proportions. By the end of that century, it is in Europe, recorded in Latin by a friar in England, who, being cautious, wrote part of it in code. Europe received a finished invention. It did not have to discover anything. What it did instead was industrialize it. And that turned out to matter more, because Europe at this moment was a continent of several hundred small states, all of them at war with one another almost permanently, all of them competing to buy the next advantage. There was no central authority to say no, and there was always a customer. Under those conditions, a technology does not sit still. The first thing the new weapon killed was the castle. A stone castle is a machine for making a small number of defenders equal to a large number of attackers. Build the walls high enough and thick enough, stock the well and the granary, and an army can sit outside for a year and go home hungry. That arrangement is the whole basis of medieval power, of feudalism itself. A lord in a castle is, in practice, independent. The cannon ended that in about a century. High walls turned out to be exactly the wrong shape, tall, thin, brittle, and impossible to miss. The vertical curtain that had been a strength for 600 years became a target. The response was to rebuild fortification from scratch. Low, thick, angled walls of packed earth faced with brick shaped like stars so that every face could be covered by fire from another. They worked. But a castle could be built by a lord. The new fortresses could only be afforded by a king, and only a king could pay for a train of artillery to knock them down. So power drained upward. The men with the biggest treasuries got the biggest guns, and the small independent lord became a landlord. The modern centralized state is, to an uncomfortable degree, a thing that gunpowder built. Which brings us back to that wall in the spring of 1453. The great bombard was cast by an engineer named Orban, and the detail that should stay with you is that he went to the Byzantines first. They wanted the gun. They simply did not have the money and could not feed him properly. So he crossed the lines and offered the same design to the Sultan, who paid him 4 times what he asked, and asked whether the gun could break the walls of Constantinople. It could. The siege was not elegant. The huge cannon was slow, and it cracked, and eventually it failed, and the city's defenders repaired the breaches at night with rubble and timber and barrels of earth. The Ottomans had dozens of other guns, and they kept firing. The wall came down on the 29th of May. What ended that day was not just a city or a dynasty. It was the idea that stone could be made thick enough. Every ruler in Europe understood the message immediately, and the arms race that followed has not stopped since. The last Roman emperor died somewhere in the breach. Nobody found the body. Now, the awkward part, and the reason gunpowder shaped empires in a way nobody expects. Charcoal is easy. Burn wood. Sulphur can be dug or imported. But saltpeter, the ingredient that actually does the work, does not occur in useful quantities in Northern Europe. You have to farm it, and you farm it out of decay. Saltpeter forms where nitrogen-rich waste rots against a wall in the presence of air, stables, dovecotes, cellars, latrines, churchyards. So European states created a job title, the saltpeter man, and gave him the legal right to enter your property, dig up the floor of your barn or your cellar, and take the earth away, whether you liked it or not. In England, in France, in the German states, for 200 years, men with a royal warrant were digging up private floors and church crypts because the state needed the nitrate. Then Europeans discovered that in parts of India, the soil made it by itself in enormous quantities and cheaply. That trade became one of the most valuable in the world. The English East India Company shipped it home by the thousands of tons, and it is not a coincidence that the company which came to control saltpeter also came to control India. The powder was not just something empires used, it was something they went and took territory to secure. The gun rewrote who could fight. A knight was the product of a lifetime. Training from childhood, armor worth as much as a farm, a war horse, and income to sustain it. A society organized itself to produce a few hundred such men, and they were the top of it. A musket takes a few weeks to learn. It is not that the musket was better. For most of its history, it was worse, inaccurate, slow, useless in rain. But it did not care. A wall of ordinary men, drilled to fire together, could bring down anyone, and no amount of breeding or courage or steel plate would stop the ball. Armor thinned, then vanished. Kept only for ceremony, infantry became the center of every army instead of its cheap edge. And the winning side became whoever could afford the drill, the muskets, the powder, and the wages. War stopped being an aristocracy's dangerous hobby and became an industry run by accountants paid for with taxes and debt. And exactly one society looked at that and decided it did not want it. Japan met the gun in 1543 when a Portuguese ship ran aground and a local lord bought 2 matchlocks off the crew. Japanese smiths copied them almost immediately and improved them, and within 30 years, the country was probably making more firearms than anywhere in Europe. At Nagashino in 1575, ranks of ordinary gunmen behind a wooden palisade destroyed the finest cavalry in the country, and everyone present understood what they had just watched. Then the wars ended. The Tokugawa unified Japan, closed it to most foreign contact, and quietly took control of the gun, restricting who could make them, licensing the smiths, buying up production, letting the skill thin out. It was not a ban, and it was never announced as one. It was a country with a settled ruling class deciding that a weapon which let a farmer kill a swordsman was a political problem and simply turning the tap down. It held for 250 years, which is the longest anyone has ever managed it. It ended in 1853 when American warships arrived in the bay with guns Japan could not answer, and the country reversed the entire policy inside a generation. You can decline an invention. You cannot decline it forever, and you cannot decline it alone. For 600 years, the powder itself barely changed, but the way it was made improved enormously. Early gunpowder was ground into a fine flour, and it had a problem. The three ingredients settled out on a bumpy road, so a barrel that left the workshop as gunpowder arrived at the battlefield as three separate powders. The fix, found in the 15th century, was to wet the mixture into a paste, dry it, and break it into grains. It is called corning, and it did two things. It locked the ingredients together permanently, and because fire could now run through the gaps between grains, it made the powder burn far faster and far stronger. Corn powder was so much more powerful that early guns burst when they were given it. From then, it is refinement. Sieve the grains to a chosen size, fine for pistols, coarse for cannon. Purify the saltpeter. Build powder mills, which were dangerous places, kept apart from towns, staffed by men in felt shoes, because a spark from a hobnail could level the building. For 6 centuries, this gray powder was the most powerful substance any human could get hold of. It stopped quite suddenly in the second half of the 19th century. Chemists had learnt to attack organic material with nitric acid, and the results were terrifying. Nitroglycerin was so unstable, it killed the people making it, including the brother of the Swedish chemist working on it. That chemist's answer was to soak the liquid into a porous earth to tame it. He called it dynamite, and it made him the richest man in Europe. And he left the fortune to a set of prizes that carry his name. For the guns, the change was smokeless powder. Old gunpowder is only about half combustible gas. The rest is solid residue, smoke that blinds the battlefield and fouls the barrel. The new nitrocellulose propellants burned almost completely, gave more power for less weight, and left the air clear. Within about 20 years, every army on Earth had switched, and 600 years of black powder ended. It did not disappear. It just went back to the two jobs it had always been best at: blowing rock apart in mines and quarries, and making the sky beautiful on a national holiday. So consider what it actually is. 3 cheap materials: burnt wood, a yellow mineral, and a salt that forms on the walls of stables, ground together in the right proportions by men who were trying to become immortal. It ended the castle, and with it, the independent lord. It made the centralized state because only a state could afford artillery. It made the trained commoner the equal of the aristocrat on a battlefield, which changed who could demand a say. It sent European ships around the world with the means to insist on being traded with. It opened the mines that fed the Industrial Revolution, and it cut the canals and the railway tunnels. Almost nothing about the modern world is untouched by it, and it began as a footnote in a manual about how to live forever, written by someone who had just watched a colleague set fire to his own face. Tonight, somewhere, a crowd will stand in the dark and look up while a few kilograms of it are burnt over their heads for no reason at all except that it is beautiful. That is the oldest use of it that we still practice, and the only one that never killed anybody on purpose.